The morning sun was just peeking through the clouds as the airport came to life. Early morning travelers rushed through the terminals, dragging their wheeled suitcases across the polished floors. Among them walked a confident figure in a crisp pilot's uniform, her captain's stripes gleaming under the fluorescent lights. She'd dreamed of this moment since she was a little girl, watching planes soar overhead from her backyard. Back then, everyone told her it was impossible. "There aren't many women pilots," they'd say, their words trying to clip her wings before she could even spread them. But she'd just smile and look up at the sky, knowing deep in her heart that's where she belonged. 15 years of hard work had brought her here. She'd worked 2 jobs to put herself through flight school, studying late into the night while her friends were out having fun. During training, she'd often been the only woman in her classes, and usually the only black person too. Some days were harder than others, but she never let the doubtful looks or whispered comments shake her determination. Now, as she walked through Atlanta International Airport's bustling Terminal A, her airline badge proudly displayed, she couldn't help but smile at how far she'd come. She'd earned every bit of her success, over 10,000 flight hours, countless certifications, and a reputation for being one of the most skilled pilots in the company. Her colleagues respected her, and many young aviation students looked up to her as a role model. The walk to the flight deck was her favorite part of the day. She'd run her hand along the plane's exterior during the pre-flight check, just like she always did, a little ritual she developed over the years. Inside the cockpit, she felt at home among the hundreds of switches, dials, and instruments. This was her office in the sky, where she truly belonged. As she settled into the captain's seat, she began her usual pre-flight routine, checking systems and reviewing weather reports for the flight to Boston. The morning light streamed through the cockpit windows, catching the golden wings pinned to her chest. Wings she'd earned through years of dedication and perseverance. She could hear the first passengers starting to board, the familiar sounds of overhead bins opening and closing, mixed with quiet conversations and shuffling feet. It was shaping up to be another routine flight, or at least that's what she thought. She had no idea that in just a few minutes, an encounter would test everything she'd worked for, and change not just her life, but the lives of everyone involved in ways none of them could have imagined. The flight attendants were going through their pre-flight checks in the cabin, their cheerful voices carrying forward to the cockpit. She pulled out the flight plan one more time, double-checking the route and weather conditions, completely unaware that she was about to become the boarding process was going smoothly, that would touch passengers filing past the cockpit door with their usual mix of tired smiles and hurried glances. Some peeked in with curiosity, others with the nervous energy of infrequent flyers seeking reassurance. The captain offered warm smiles to each one, something she always did to help put anxious travelers at ease. Then came the moment that would change everything. A well-dressed woman in her mid-50s, pulling a designer carry-on bag, stopped abruptly at the cockpit entrance. Her perfectly manicured hand gripped the door frame as she did a double take, her expression shifting from surprise to disbelief, then to something darker. "Excuse me," the woman called out, her voice cutting through the usual cabin noise. There must be some mistake. She looked around as if expecting someone else to appear, someone who matched her mental image of what a pilot should look like. The other passengers behind her shifted uncomfortably, creating a small traffic jam in the narrow aisle. The captain turned in her seat, maintaining her professional composure despite recognizing the all-too-familiar look in the woman's eyes. She'd seen it before, that mixture of doubt and dismissal that had followed her throughout her career. Still, each time it happened, it stung just as much as the first. "Is there something I can help you with?" the captain asked calmly, her voice steady and professional. The woman's response came quick and sharp, like she'd been waiting for the invitation to speak her mind. "Actually, yes. I need to speak with the real pilot," she announced, her voice getting louder with each word. "I've been flying for 30 years, and I've never seen." She let her words trail off, but her meaning hung heavy in the air. Several passengers behind her gasped quietly, while others started pulling out their phones. A young flight attendant stepped forward, trying to defuse the situation. "Ma'am, I assure you our captain is highly qualified." But the woman cut her off with a wave of her hand. She was already pulling out her own phone, the screen's blue light reflecting off her expensive jewelry. "I need to speak to a supervisor right now," she demanded, starting to record. "I pay too much money to fly with this airline to be part of some diversity experiment. I want to see the captain's credentials right now." The cabin had gone eerily quiet. Even the usual sounds of baggage being stowed and seats being adjusted had stopped. Every eye was on the unfolding scene, every ear tuned to the confrontation. In the tense silence, a child's whispered question to their mother carried clearly. "Mommy, why is that lady being so mean to the pilot?" The captain felt her heart racing, but years of handling emergency procedures and split-second decisions had taught her to stay calm under pressure. She knew this moment would define not just this flight, but perhaps something much larger. Her response in the next few seconds would matter more than any weather challenge or technical issue she'd ever faced in the cockpit. Behind the woman, other passengers had begun to murmur, some in obvious disapproval of her behavior. A businessman in a suit shook his head in disgust, while an elderly woman clutched her purse tightly, looking deeply troubled by the scene. The tension in the cabin was building like storm clouds before a thunderstorm, and everyone could feel that this was just the beginning of something bigger than a simple pre-flight disagreement. The situation was getting worse by the minute. The woman's phone was still recording, its camera lens pointed directly at the cockpit like an accusatory finger. Her voice had taken on a theatrical quality, as if she was performing for an invisible audience that would later watch her video online. "I'd want everyone to see this," she announced, panning her phone around the cabin. "This airline is putting all our lives at risk. I need to see credentials right now." Her voice trembled with what seemed like genuine fear, though it was fear born from prejudice rather than any real danger. The flight attendants huddled briefly, speaking in hushed tones about protocol for removing disruptive passengers. The head flight attendant, a veteran of 20 years, stepped forward again. Her voice was firm but professional. "Ma'am, if you can't take your seat and respect our crew, we'll need to have you leave the aircraft." But the woman wasn't finished. She turned to other passengers, seeking allies in her cause. "Don't tell me none of you are concerned about this. About who's flying this plane." Her eyes darted from face to face, searching for support that wasn't there. Instead, she found uncomfortable glances and disapproving headshakes. A young college student near the front spoke up, her voice shaking but determined. "The only person making me uncomfortable right now is you." Several passengers nodded in agreement, and someone in the back started clapping briefly. The captain remained in her seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap where no one could see them trembling. She'd faced discrimination before, but never so publicly, never with so many witnesses. Through the cockpit windows, she could see the ground crew finishing their work, unaware of the drama unfolding inside the aircraft. The woman's face flushed red as she continued her tirade, now scrolling through her phone. "I'm looking up the requirements for pilots right now. There's no way. I mean, how did you even?" She stumbled over her words, her prejudices colliding with the reality of the captain's presence in the cockpit. A businessman in first class stood up, his patience clearly worn thin. "Some of us have connecting flights to catch. This is ridiculous." Others joined in with similar complaints, the delayed departure time now adding to the tension in the cabin. The captain could hear her co-pilot's quiet suggestion through their headsets. "We can call security. Just say the word." But something held her back from making that call. Years of experience had taught her that sometimes the hardest moments could become the most important ones. Meanwhile, the woman's teenage daughter stood slightly behind her mother, looking mortified. She kept tugging at her mother's sleeve, whispering, "Mom, please stop. Please." The girl's face was a mix of embarrassment and something deeper, Perhaps the painful realization that your parent isn't always right. The flight attendants had positioned themselves strategically in the aisle, ready to intervene if needed. One of them was on the phone with the gate agent, discussing options. The cabin temperature seemed to rise with the tension, and the usual pre-flight announcements were now significantly delayed. Through it all, the captain noticed something interesting. Passengers were pulling out their phones, but not to join in the woman's protest. They were documenting her behavior, perhaps understanding that they were witnessing something significant. The woman's intended expose was backfiring, turning her into the subject of scrutiny rather than the captain she was trying to discredit. The situation had reached a boiling point. Something had to give. The captain knew her next move would be crucial, not just for this flight, but for every young girl who dreamed of sitting in a cockpit someday. She took a deep breath, unclipped her seatbelt, and stood up. The whole cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The captain stood in her cockpit doorway, her shoulders straight and her head held high. The overhead lights caught the 4 stripes on her uniform sleeve, each one earned through years of dedication. The cabin fell silent as she stepped forward, her movements calm and measured, like she was doing a pre-flight check. She had a choice to make. The airline's protocol was clear. Any passenger disrupting flight safety or causing a disturbance could be removed. One word from her, and security would escort the woman off the plane. It would be quick, simple, and within her rights as captain. But something told her this moment called for a different approach. The woman's phone was still recording, its lens now pointed directly at the captain's face. Behind it, the woman's expression was a mix of challenge and uncertainty, like someone whose worldview was starting to crack, but wasn't ready to admit it yet. "Ma'am," the captain began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed cabin. "I understand you have concerns about your safety." She paused, letting those words sink in. "Safety is my primary concern, too. It has been for the past 15 years I've been flying." The woman's hand holding the phone trembled slightly, but she didn't lower it. The captain continued, her voice taking on a tone of quiet confidence that came from thousands of hours in the sky. "I could tell you about my 10,000 flight hours. I could show you my air transport pilot license, my type ratings for 3 different aircraft, or my master's degree in aeronautical science." She gestured toward the cockpit behind her. "I could explain every switch, every dial, every procedure in that flight deck." A baby started crying somewhere in the back of the plane, and its mother quickly soothed it. The captain waited for the cabin to quiet again before continuing. The tension in the air was different now, less angry, more anticipatory. "I could have you removed from this flight," she said softly, and several passengers nodded in agreement. "But I don't want to do that. Instead, I want to invite you to learn something today. Something about judging people based on how they look rather than their capabilities." The woman's teenage daughter had moved closer now, no longer hiding behind her mother in embarrassment. Her eyes were fixed on the captain with a mix of admiration and hope. "When I was her age," the captain gestured toward the teenager, "someone told me I couldn't be a pilot because of how I look. They were wrong." She smiled gently. "Just like you're wrong now." The woman's phone had slowly lowered during the captain's speech, though it was still recording. Her face had lost its angry flush, replaced by something that looked almost like shame. "So here's what I'm offering," the captain continued. "You can either leave this flight. There's another one to Boston in 3 hours, or you can take your seat, and we can all get to our destination safely. Either way, I'll be in that cockpit, doing the job I was trained to do and love to do." The entire cabin seemed to be holding its breath. Flight attendants stood ready to act on whatever happened next. The co-pilot watched from his seat, respect evident in his expression. Even the ground crew outside had paused their work, sensing something important was happening inside the aircraft. This wasn't just about one flight anymore. It was about every barrier that had ever been broken, every ceiling that had ever been shattered. The captain stood there, a living example of progress, offering not just stern authority, but understanding and education. The next few seconds would determine more than just how this flight would proceed. They would show whether minds could be changed, whether prejudice could be overcome with professionalism and dignity. The ball was in the woman's court now, and everyone waited to see what she would do. The silence in the cabin was broken by a quiet but clear voice. "Mom, that's enough." The teenager stepped out from behind her mother, her hands shaking, but her voice growing stronger with each word. Her next words changed everything. "Do you know how rare it is to see a female pilot, let alone a black female pilot?" The girl's voice carried through the cabin, drawing everyone's attention. She'd been clutching her backpack tightly, and now she quickly unzipped it, pulling out a slightly crumpled paper. "I got an A+ on this report last semester. It was about breaking barriers in aviation." The woman's phone was now pointing at the floor, forgotten in her hand as her daughter continued. The girl's voice grew more confident as she spoke, like she'd been waiting for this moment without knowing it would come. "There are over 700,000 pilots in America," she said, glancing at her report. "But you know how many black female pilots there are in major airlines? Less than 150. She looked directly at the captain. "That's why I did my report on them. Because they're making history every single day they go to work." The other passengers had gone completely still. Even those who had been complaining about the delay were now listening intently. The captain stood quietly, watching as this young girl unknowingly became part of a moment that would be remembered long after this flight. "I interviewed a female pilot for my project," the teenager continued, her voice getting a bit shaky. "She told me about all the times people didn't believe in her, all the times they said she couldn't do it." She turned to her mother then, tears starting to form in her eyes. "And now you're doing the exact same thing. You're being everything I wrote about in my report. Everything that's wrong, everything that needs to change." A tissue appeared from somewhere in the crowd, passed forward by an elderly passenger who was wiping her own eyes. The girl took it with a grateful nod, but didn't stop speaking. "The pilot I interviewed said something I'll never forget. She said that every time someone tells her she can't fly a plane, she proves them wrong by flying it better than anyone else." The girl looked at the captain with admiration. "And she said that every time she proves them wrong, she makes it a little easier for the next girl who dreams of flying." The woman's face had lost all its previous anger, replaced by something that looked like a mixture of shame and revelation. Her daughter's words seemed to be hitting her harder than any argument could have. "I've never been more embarrassed in my life," the teenager finished, her voice now barely a whisper. "And I've never been more disappointed." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of truth spoken from the heart. The cabin erupted in applause. Not the polite kind you hear after a standard announcement, but the genuine kind that comes when people witness something real and important. Some passengers were openly crying. Others were nodding vigorously. A group of businessmen in the front row had completely forgotten their delayed meeting in Boston. The woman stood frozen, her phone now dark in her limp hand. She looked at her daughter as if seeing her for the first time. This young person who had just taught her mother one of life's most important lessons. The captain watched the scene unfold, understanding that sometimes the most powerful changes come from the most unexpected sources. The next few moments would determine how this story would end. But something had already shifted in the cabin, not just for the woman and her daughter, but for everyone who had witnessed this unexpected lesson in courage, dignity, and the power of speaking truth. The applause slowly died down, replaced by a different kind of silence than before. It wasn't the tense silence of confrontation anymore, but rather the quiet that comes when people realize they're part of something meaningful. The woman's phone had disappeared into her purse, its recording forgotten. She looked around the cabin, really seeing the faces of her fellow passengers for the first time. An elderly black woman in the third row was dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. A young Asian man in a business suit was showing something on his phone to his seatmate, probably looking up statistics about pilots and diversity. Two little girls, maybe 7 or 8 years old, were whispering excitedly to each other while pointing at the captain's uniform. The woman's face had transformed. The angry mask she'd worn earlier had crumbled, revealing something raw and real underneath. Her eyes met her daughter's, then darted away, unable to hold that honest gaze. Her hand reached out, groping blindly for the back of a seat to steady herself. She began, but her voice cracked. She cleared her throat and tried again. I don't know what to say. The words came out barely above a whisper, but in the quiet cabin, everyone heard them. The flight attendant who had first tried to intervene stepped forward with a glass of water. The simple act of kindness seemed to break something loose inside the woman. Her shoulders started to shake slightly. All these years, she said, taking the water with trembling hands, I thought I was teaching my daughter to be strong, to speak up when she saw something wrong. She looked at her daughter again, this time managing to hold her gaze. But she just taught me what that really means. The captain hadn't moved from her spot, but her expression had softened. She'd seen this before, the moment when someone's worldview cracks open and lets in new light. It wasn't always comfortable, but it was always important. A passenger's phone chimed with a notification. Someone had already posted a video of the incident online. The woman flinched at the sound, probably realizing that her moment of prejudice would soon be seen by thousands. But then something unexpected happened. Her daughter stepped closer and took her hand. Mom, she said softly, we can make this right. We can show people that people can learn and change. The wisdom in the teenager's voice made her sound much older than her years. The other passengers watched as the woman straightened up, squaring her shoulders like someone preparing to face something difficult but necessary. She turned to the captain, and this time there was no challenge in her stance, no anger in her expression. Captain, she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes, I was wrong. Completely wrong. And I'm sorry. The words were simple but sincere, carrying the weight of real understanding. More phones had come out now, recording this moment too, not to shame or mock, but to capture something rare and valuable. The moment when hate gave way to hope, when ignorance yielded to understanding. The captain nodded, accepting the apology with the same grace she'd shown throughout the confrontation. Someone near the back of the plane started clapping again, and this time the applause spread quickly, filling the cabin with the sound of forgiveness and change. The woman's daughter beamed with pride, no longer the embarrassed teenager, but a young woman who had helped bridge a gap she hadn't even known she could cross. The two flight attendants exchanged knowing looks. They'd seen their share of mid-flight drama, but this was something entirely different. 3 months passed, and autumn leaves were falling outside the airport's giant windows. The captain sat in the airport coffee shop, stirring her drink absently while checking her watch. The viral video of that summer day had racked up millions of views, spawning countless discussions about prejudice, progress, and the power of standing up for what's right. She wasn't sure what to expect from this meeting. The email had arrived a week ago, appearing in her inbox like a message in a bottle washing up on shore. The woman from the flight had asked to meet, saying she had something important to share. The coffee shop door chimed, and the captain looked up to see the woman and her daughter walking in. They were different from how she remembered them. The woman's face softer, more open, the daughter walking with new confidence. They carried a thick folder and what looked like a laptop. Thank you for meeting us, the woman said as they sat down. Her voice was warm, nothing like the harsh tones from that day on the plane. We've been busy these past few months. The daughter pulled out her laptop, opening it to reveal a website homepage. At the top was a bold title, Wings of Change, Breaking Barriers in Aviation. The captain leaned forward, curious. After that day, the woman explained, I couldn't just go back to my normal life. I kept thinking about what my daughter said about there being less than 150 black female pilots in major airlines. She paused, collecting her thoughts. So I started doing research. A lot of research. The daughter clicked through the website, showing page after page of resources, scholarships, and training programs. Mom's been working with local schools, she explained proudly. She's been setting up meetings with airline executives, talking about creating more opportunities for young girls interested in aviation. The woman pulled out some papers from her folder. I've been attending diversity and inclusion workshops, really listening and learning. But more importantly, I've been using my business connections to make things happen. She spread the papers on the table, proposals for mentorship programs, fundraising plans, community outreach initiatives. We've already raised enough money to fund 5 full scholarships, the daughter added excitedly. And 3 major airlines have agreed to provide training support and internship opportunities. The captain picked up one of the papers, reading it carefully. The program was comprehensive, well thought out, addressing not just financial barriers, but also the social and cultural challenges that kept many young people from pursuing their dreams of flying. But we need your help, the woman said softly. Your experience, your knowledge, it would mean everything to have you involved. To show these young people that it's possible, that they can do it too. Outside, a plane took off, its engines roaring with possibility. The captain watched it climb into the blue sky, thinking about all the young girls who might be watching too, wondering if they could ever sit in that cockpit. There's something else, the daughter said, pulling out her phone. She showed a group chat with over 50 young girls from various backgrounds, all sharing their dreams of becoming pilots. They all saw the video. But instead of focusing on the bad part, they saw how you handled it. You became their hero. The woman reached across the table, her eyes sincere. We can't change what happened that day, but maybe we can help change tomorrow. Will you help us? The captain looked at the website again, at the faces of young girls already in the program, their eyes shining with the same dreams she'd had as a child. She thought about all the barriers she'd faced, all the times she'd wished for someone to show her the way. When do we start? She asked, smiling. The woman and her daughter beamed. Outside, another plane took off, carrying with it the promise of change. Sometimes, the worst moments in our lives lead us to our greatest purpose. Sometimes a single flight can change not just one person's journey, but create a pathway for generations to come.